Yeah.
Believes he needs, et cetera, but I also think that it would behoove us to hear, and I hate to use this from the horse's mouth, maybe the dog's mouth, as to what really is involved in starting a canine unit or canines multiple unit. So rather, and since we are under a timeline of August 3rd to put something on the ballot, I'd hate to try to rush this through in a haphazard way. I think if it's something where we all agree and we're comfortable going to the citizens for a second request for some additional funding, if we can't find it, and you know, it's still possible that we may find some money somehow, some way, I don't know, then it could always be put on a future ballot, perhaps in the spring, or if it's really that critical, maybe look for some kind of special ballot at some point. But I think we need to have some more specific discussions just on that topic, as opposed to we're looking for a bunch of money for streets and police dogs. So, but I have committed, yes, I'd like to reach out to some individuals to see if they could come to council and talk to us, give us some of their experience from ongoing and what it took to get it started. Some of them may be recent startups and some of them may have been ongoing for quite some time. So with that, I would say, if we can, if we agree that I'm willing to take on this and, but sort of table it for tonight's discussion.
Mr. Whitehill?
In regards to the K-9 units, when we first started the discussions of this whole process, one of the things we talked about was some form of shared load as far as for how the funding could be acquired. So to that end, what has been in my mind is to have a very reasonable levy type approach to it as far as for the K-9 units, whether that's 1 mil or something close to that. So I would just put that out there as well as a possible funding source. I think that if we can get, there's been discussions as far as contributions, charitable contributions, which might help with equipment and with training and so forth. But we need to be mindful of there's still salaries, there's still benefits, there's still those expenses that will not go away, that will take a department that is stretching every dollar that it can and trying to create something out of that as well. So from the standpoint of letting the voters speak and seeing whether the popular support that we're trying to gauge right now is there, I would just offer that out there as a possible funding source.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Nistic. I agree. I think it's time to get this before the public. We need to rid the city of drugs. And it's been said by others that you can't arrest your way out of it, but we can certainly provide a heck of a deterrent for anyone engaging in that activity or contemplating engaging in that activity. The implementation and how it's done, the histories of other cities, and the expertise of our current police chief, I think, will carry us into a position of having a K-9 unit that's top-notch, unparalleled, and provide the safety for the people of this city and our visitors. So I strongly would urge, along with any motion or movement toward tax increase for streets, that we have an issue also for a K-9 unit for this city.
Mr. Drummond?
Mr. Chairman, well, I would ask the mayor, have you or the auditor looked at ongoing, in the email that I've got in front of me, a copy of which, you talk about the auditor will require an income stream in addition to what we currently have. And yes, we can put a levy on the ballot and it might pass, but that may not last forever.
What, again, the millage would have to be determined. I'm not sure if Betty has that, but I'd like to point out that drugs just aren't going to just cost us what the cost of a K-9 unit is. We already have 2 officers full-time doing drug task force work. So if you're looking for exact dollars and cents, I don't know what one drug task force or K-9 unit would cost without information from Betty. I have the cost of the dog and the training and things like that from the chief. But I'd have to estimate that the cost, not only in human misery, but in dollars and cents to the taxpayers of this city for having drugs in the community, is hard to calculate, but $500,000. I mean, if we really wanted to have a levy directed toward drugs that would provide funding for a K-9 unit, with the other funds that come in from that particular levy or tax be used to fight drugs, then we could certainly use that to help offset some of the increased costs, which have drug money away from the capital fund into the general fund to pay for the 2 officers that we currently employ that don't work in Salem. Now, not work in Salem, I mean they don't work on a shift, but they do come into Salem to do surveillance and also do drug raids. So the worth of having those 2 gentlemen on the drug task forces has not been offset by any levy, but we've incurred those costs and we continue to. So pick an amount. I'm not sure Jeff, if you have any information regarding what 1 mil would bring in, but
You know, I was looking for that, Mayor, as you were talking there.
about $300,000. The drug dog wouldn't cost that much. One canine unit wouldn't cost that much. If we opted for 2, it may approach that, but I'd like to see the offset of the cost of drugs in this community be addressed by council and not just say, well, it's an additional cost. What about the costs we're already incurring? And if we're going to protect people from this activity, then make it 2 mils and we'll sell it to the community and to the people of the city that this is what we need to do. We need to make your community safe. We've already done quite a bit with the funds that we have in the general fund, and those costs just don't go down. If we had no drugs in this community, what a great thing it would be. We wouldn't have to have 2 officers paying them on different drug task forces already. I don't have the exact to the penny amount, but if it's $300,000 for a mill, I'd say 2 mills ought to go a long way toward helping to defray all the costs that we have associated with drugs in the community that perhaps we forget about, that we already have, that we're already covering in the general fund, and we'll continue to, regardless of how your decision is on whether we go forward or not. But I think it's time to do this, and I'm sorry it may be coincidental with a levy for paving streets, but I wouldn't want to ignore it, and if it takes 5 times to go to the voters, then we'll go 5 times. You just have to be committed to this.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think we've heard clearly now that the people we've talked to amongst ourselves, even in here, that we want to keep them separate, the streets and the drug dogs. And I think that Mr. Drummond is correct that we need to take our time, understand this, understand the cost, because I know the conversations that I've had, you know, I've already learned that, you know, we don't need to buy a new vehicle. We can retrofit an existing vehicle. Maybe the dogs can be donated. Maybe we can learn more from the other jurisdictions around us who already have dogs. I think we all agree that that is something that we need to acquire. I mean, I've learned that a lot of the communities around us already have drug dogs, drug units, dog units. And so if you're a criminal, where are you going to go? You go to the community that doesn't have it. So I think we owe it to our city, we owe it to the citizens, and we got to continue to fight this battle with drugs, and we need to pursue this. But I do agree with Mr. Drummond, we need to take our time. I don't think we should have 2 issues on the November ballot. I think if we see that the costs are so great that we need to have another levy, property tax possibly, millage, I would recommend keeping that separate from the November ballot and maybe steering that more towards the spring. My comments on that.
Mr. Drummond?
The only thing that I'd add is that, you know, we've gone, you know, I came on to council 4 years ago, and the first question I put to Chief Floor was, you know, what about a police dog, drug dog? I'd rather get things up to par manpower-wise. And the same thing that Chief Panzot said, and I know we know that. But will another few months be so critical in this fight that we can't do it correctly? You know, we're sitting here and we've got a deadline of a number of days to get something together, voted on, and presented to the Board of Elections in time for the August 3rd deadline date. And we're saying, well, do we do 1 mil, 2 mils? How much is this going to cost? I think if we are serious, and we talked about, you know, taking this to the public and saying, here's what we'd like to do, I think that's when we need to sit down, have the discussions, and say, all right, it's X number of dollars. This is what we're going to commit to, X dollars for these canine units. And Maybe we can retrofit a vehicle, maybe we find that, one dog has to suffice for the first year or two or something, but get all of that firmed up, as opposed to saying, time's running out, we've got to get a decision made now, so let's just ask, we'll go to the voters and say, let's go for a 2-mil vote, and whatever we don't spend, we'll commit to fighting drugs. Well, we're fighting against drugs now, and we're doing with what the resources we do have. But if we continue that for another 3 or 4 months till we start to get this firmed up and say, this is the amount of money that this would, we're going to commit to and come to the voters and ask to fund. And I think if we do it that way, the public says, they're not just grabbing a number for the sake of a number because they got to get it done in this amount of time.
Mr. Whitehill.
I can't say that I disagree. However, I guess what I would say is that is exactly what we're doing regarding the streets, in my opinion, at this point. We're choosing a number that we think makes sense, that we'll see what we can do with, and we're doing it as quickly as we can because the ballot issue is coming up.
And I might be saying exactly the same thing when we start on that topic.
Does anybody want to make a motion, or should we table this discussion on the K-9 unit at this time until we gather more information?
I think that's what,
I'd make a motion that we table it. I don't know if I have to have a motion to table it, but
It helps in moving things along.
yeah, I'll second that motion to table then.
All in favor? Aye.
now, favor, I will say that I publicly stated would like to work at getting and helping gather that information and bring it to council, bring it to the public. So it's not like, okay, now we can sit back for another 4 months or 5 months. We're going to be
Right.
pursuing this. It's just that, I think what we're saying here is it's not getting ready for a November vote,
Right.
maybe a spring vote.
Yeah, I think it is important to publicly express that council does, that it's a general feeling among council that it's something that we really need to go forward with in some manner. So on to the income tax or the property tax issue. I mean, at the infrastructure topic, some of the issues with that are what type of tax should it be, what length of time should it be, and what's the plan for it. And I'll let, Mr. Cushman got some stuff out about that this past week regarding an ordinance that he wanted to put together, and I'll let him start discussion on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would to go directly to Mr. Whitehill's comments. And the fact of the matter is, the number that we've discussed is 0.25%. The fact of the matter is, it's not enough money. But we're looking at a number that is digestible for the city. There's been 2 0.5% tax levies failed miserably. So do we want to go to the plate, strike out again with that? 0.25%. I've talked to a lot of people. I've had a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, just more than I ever expected. And God is my witness. I have had one person say to me, "How can you do that?" Everybody else that I've talked to has said to me, "We need to do something with our streets. We've got to get on this. We've got to get a handle on this." And they agree with the 0.25%. So I guess the situation that we're confronted with right now, tonight actually, is whether that's going to be 0.25% or do we go for 0.5%? I would argue that neither one of those numbers is enough.
Why not is it a property tax?
I'm sorry, sir?
Why not also whether it's a property tax?
I just think that we make it too convoluted, we're going to confuse the voters, and I just think we've got to keep it simple. We met with John Vonagel, and we found out, at least I did, I found out a number that startled me. Years back, the city allowed about $600,000 for the streets. Mr. Vonagel's comment was, that was barely enough to keep up with what was needed. In recent years, it's been much less than that, as evidenced in our streets.
He also commented that asphalt was half the price back then, too.
That's
So we're
correct. Costs are up. And so 0.25%, if we continue to fund the streets with what we, line item now of $250,000, we may see a revenue of 1.3. It's not enough. It simply isn't enough, but we can potentially meet with Amanda again, bond counsel, and bond that out, work out a finance package for that amount of money, and do what we can. And we need to form a committee to discuss how do we go about these? What streets do we do? And we learned yesterday, talking to Mr. Von Ogle as well, that, hey, you guys need to be well aware that there's more to this than just putting down a nice new top coat. Some of these storm sewers are a mess. Sewage lines are a mess, and you can't just top coat that. So that means, in some of these streets, we need to do engineering studies first, so we can determine what is below grade, what needs fixed. And we've learned, and I don't know if I should even say this now, but we've also learned that the OPWC has programs to help communities with stormwater runoff, sewage, but not with streets, not with top coating, not with re-asphalt. OPWC would be engaged if we have to replace underlying piping, groundwork, and whatnot. And so with that, the thinking is, and this is all, it has to be hammered out yet, but the thinking is, let's find out which streets are going to need, substructural work, sewage draining, stormwater runoff. Let's find out what streets are going to need that and also need resurface. And maybe those are the streets that we identify first, so we can use the benefits of OPWC and go with that. So and these are all just very new discussions. And the direction that we go still needs hammered out. But coming back full circle, 0.25% isn't enough, but 0.25% gets us on the path, and we begin to address our very deteriorating street situation. And I think if we try to put 0.5% out there, I just fear it'll fail. And we have got to take a step forward. And I'm willing to say, I'm willing to ask for this evening a motion to put a 4% tax ordinance or resolution before council.
I'll throw out a couple pieces of data, just to help also. My position's always been that I feel like if you're going to fix infrastructure that's property related, it should be a property tax. I've had a lot of feedback on that over the past couple of weeks, and I had some discussions with some accountants also that have pointed out, and I'm looking at the Ohio tax tables, the historical Ohio tax tables here, and if you have a $50,000 family income, the taxes over the past 5 years for the state of Ohio have gone down appreciably, much more than what a 0.25% income tax increase would be. So, so although I still believe that it's more fair to tax property for infrastructure improvements, I've come to the realization that a 0.25% income tax really wouldn't put anyone further behind than they were 5 years ago. It's not something that, a 0.25% on $50,000 is something like $125 a year. The tax break over the past 5 years on a $50,000 income in the state of Ohio has been much greater than that. Your taxes have gone down in the state of Ohio because they're pushing these costs onto the local community so that Ohio can show that they're lowering your taxes. But the reality is they're taking the money away from the local communities that they used to. So we're now forced to pay for things ourselves that we used to get. We used to get money from the state government. They would collect the money from all the local municipalities and income tax, and then they'd spread it around like peanut butter around the state. Well, they're not spreading the peanut butter quite as thick anymore. which actually is not a bad thing, because a 1/4% that we would raise that would hurt people less than they were 5 years ago. I mean, it's not going to be as bad as it was 5 years ago with state and local taxes combined, would raise more money locally than we used to get from the state anyhow. So we'd be able to actually do more locally. So my feeling is kind of, my own personal feeling is kind of changed, that I could take it or leave it, you know, whether it's an income tax or whether it's a property tax. And then the question then comes into what's the length of time. A 5-year, $1.2 million cash stream can be noted out at about $5.8 million in year one, and you can do $5.8 million worth of work year one, and then spend the next 4 years paying it back. If it was a permanent tax instead, then you got $1.2 million cash stream. You can get a lot more. You can get $5 million the first year, $5 million the second year, $5 million the third, and then maintain. So anyhow, those are the questions. Is it a property tax or an income tax? Does anybody else have a feeling on that?
I don't necessarily have a feeling. I mean, I think what we also have to keep in mind in all of this discussion, Mr. Whitehill pointed out in the last couple of meetings, that these things aren't going away. I can't remember the last time I read in the paper that somebody's levy, or, you know, that they're collecting funds
Renewal.
is not being renewed, or they're not seeking a renewal. Sometimes they've been, you know, voted down, or I guess mostly those are the ones they've been trying to add on. But it's, you know, perhaps if it's more economically feasible as far as a long-term picture, how much we can use, you know, borrow against, if you would, by saying, let's make this is a permanent, as much as permanent could be. 5 years from now, if everything's going wonderfully and we got money coming in from various sources, and we could say, you know, we got plenty of money in the bank, we're going to talk about reducing it. You know, could it happen? Possible, probably not. But the bottom line is, if we say we're going to do it for 5 years, and based on that, our bond counsel says, well, you can get this out of it in this way, and so on, and we've agreed, I think, that we're not going to get everything we need to get done based on that amount of money, and nor would we necessarily right off the bat if we went to a permanent tax, but we might get more for it, more bang for our buck. But also things to keep in mind, in another 2 years, and the auditor might confirm this, you know, our payments on the TIF zone, the East TIF zone, are done. So we've got some money freed up from that. You know, another couple of years, I think we're due possibly for another payment from the oil and gas leases that we may or may not be able to renew. So there's always the potential for monies of that nature to also be directed to streets. I mean, right now, I'm assuming, the mayor, you can't sit down and firmly plan for using Chesapeake money for anything, because we don't know we're going to get another one.
That's absolutely true. A lot of, more than half of the money that we received went to pay old debt.
Right.
So it helps the bond counsel out in selling bonds for the future. Our rating probably improved because of that.
So I think in a situation, you know, a couple of years' time, if Chesapeake comes back and says, yeah, we're going to sign up again, and we get another $1-point-something million, we may have had the discussion already by then that says, if we get that in, that will go towards more street repairs if we haven't been able to touch what we've been able to, or we should have touched by that point. You know, whatever payments that we've saving for the East TIF zone, you know, if it can be applied to streets if we need to, or debt repayment on other debt, whatever. But I think, you know, getting back to the comment, Mr. Whitehill, about, you know, do we really know the number? You know, I agreed with Mr. Buda when he said that day. It's like, you know, what are we going to do? You know, but at the same time, if we sit here and start getting studies and so on, we're going to have studies for 6 months, and, you know, it's just going on and on. But certainly, I think if we started at 1/4%, realistically, I think we should change our rate permanently from 1 to 1.25. That's not going to put us, you know, I think, what have we got? 4, 5 municipalities of our size in the state that are at 1%. So it's not like we're the only one that's going to be 1.25. There'll still be many more that's higher than that. But I think by doing so, we can have perhaps a little bit longer term plan in place to deal with these streets. But if we can't go to something more permanent, certainly I wouldn't turn down a 5-year thing and readdress it.
I will point out, though, you mentioned we should just go to 1.25. The one thing that we did learn, you know, in the last meeting was that we actually, if we were to target a income tax of 0.25%, it can be targeted for infrastructure only. If we went to 1.25 and just went to 1.25, well, then it would be subject to the split. It would be subject to increased operation costs. It would be, you know, so we could end up future councils could end up eating that up in just, you know, regular operations costs, and we'd be back to an 85-15 split, and then we'd be looking at 1.5 or 2% or whatever. So
given that, then I think I would adjust my statement and say I'd go for the 5 years. I want this money to go for one reason only, and that's to fix the streets. Whatever we need to do to fix the streets. I don't want at some point down the road where we're saying, you know what, we're a little shy on, you know, and not to pick on the mayor and the building, but, you know, we really got to get the roof. Well, let's take a little from the street fund here just for the time being. We'll put it back. I mean, that's what happened to Social Security. Just give us a little bit of that. We'll put it right back. Don't worry. It's going right back in the pot.
Mr. Whitehill?
Just to clarify that, you said, I thought the last meeting we said that we could take that 0.25% and designate it only towards streets. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify. So we can make sure that that is only to streets.
Yes.
But were you saying that's only in the case if it's a temporary, or you're saying whether it's temporary or permanent, it could be?
No, the auditor's saying either way,
Oh, okay,
temporary or
well,
permanent.
yeah, I mean, that's the requirement from my perspective is whatever we do in whatever fashion, it's going to be entirely allocated to doing streets and nothing else.
Mr. Whitehill?
I just had a couple notes that I made when Mr. Cushman was speaking, and one is, as I talk to people, one thing that I do is I ask them when they say they support it, whether they actually are paying it or not, just as another validation, because it's easy to say, yeah, I think we should absolutely do that if they don't actually have earned income, and maybe all of them did. And then the other part that I found interesting was that 600,000, I think you quoted, that was barely keeping up back then. To me, when we're talking about 300,000 nowadays and the raised costs, I think that's probably the strongest argument I've heard, you know, yet in this process to make this permanent, to avoid us being in a situation where we have a bunch of freshly paved streets that we cannot maintain anymore, and then come right back to that situation. So I would also fall on the side of saying, if we're going to do this, we know we're going to need it. We know that the cost of maintaining these streets, we know as far as our borrowing ability based on permanent revenue stream, that it needs to be with a good plan. I agree with the follow-up as far as committee and the plan and so forth, but I think it's something that needs to be a permanent change.
I will comment that when we talked to Mr. Volno, that we started to map out a potential plan, you know, focusing on recognizing that whatever a 0.25% raises, people can't expect that they're going to vote for this 0.25% and their street's going to get paved. You know, because it's just not enough to pave everyone's street. So, you know, the first focus needs to be on what are those streets that are most traveled by, what are the most traveled streets? The streets that everybody uses. You know, State Street, 3rd Street, Pershing Street, Ellsworth, Lincoln, you know, Route 9, you know, the Franklin, you know, the corridors in and out of the city. You know, there needs to be a focus on the core of the city. The streets in the downtown and bordering the downtown and all around the downtown and in the downtown need to always look tip-top shape, you know, and then overlay with that what we know about the substructure of the streets. Where are the streets that are those main streets, that are those most traveled streets, that are also potentially eligible for Ohio Public Works Commission money, you know, and then those would be the first ones if they're in bad shape already, you know, so we're starting to develop that, okay, well, what is the rationale and criteria for which streets are going to get picked for this work? Now, on top of that, we learned from bond counsel, you know, that about what we could do as far as a special assessment program. And I personally want to favor that. That's not something that has to be on a ballot. It's not something that gets decided by the voters. It's just a structure that we put together. So you put together a committee, an equalization committee. The equalization committee reviews a special assessment request. If you live on a street with 40 neighbors and 30 of your neighbors say, hey, we're willing to pitch in 1/3 the cost of getting our street paved, if the city pitches in 2/3, then it goes to the equalization committee. They determine whether or not that's acceptable, and then it just gets put on your tax duplicate. So it's like getting a home equity line of credit without having to apply for it. So over 20 years, your property tax might go up $50 a year in order to get your street paved. And you don't have to wait until, year 7 when your street finally comes up on the program. And if there's any grant money, it could make it so that you don't have to pay your street at all, or pay for your street at all. So anyhow, there's mechanisms we can put in place so that this money, whatever it is, whether it's 5 years or whether it's permanent, focuses on those streets that everybody kind of drives on, and then put another mechanism together so that, I've got a couple of roads in my ward where people are constantly calling up and saying, why isn't my street being paved? Well, we can have a process in place by which they can get their street paved. So, Mr. Drummond?
A question for you gentlemen that spoke with Mr. Volnagel, and maybe he didn't bring it up, but can we assume that those streets that have water and sewer issues that need to be addressed, that it's the Utilities Commission that's footing the bill for that?
Well,
All
yeah,
we're
there's-
going to do is pave the street, fix the street, and pave it again.
Well, the Ohio Public Works money would match with sewer.
But the point I'm getting to
Money.
is none of that work would come out of this levy
Right.
or this tax increase, whatever
Right.
it might be.
Storm
That was our
sewers would.
understanding.
Sorry?
Storm sewers would.
Wouldn't that come out of the sewer funds,
It wouldn't come, the utility,
wastewater funds, I mean?
storm sewers would come out of this tax. Replacements for storm sewers, curbs, gutters, storm sewer, if necessary. It would not come from the utility department. That their water lines and sewer lines,
That's sanitary lines, yeah.
sanitary lines
Right.
and water, but not the storm sewers. Those
So
would come
I guess, what was was it the storm sewers that's in a mess, or,
Yeah, primarily it's the storm sewer drainage, surface runoff.
all right.
Mr. Cushing?
Chairman, I appreciate Mr. Whitehill's comments again on making this a permanent tax. However, I disagree with that, and I think we need to make this a 5-year renewable levy for the simple fact to earn it from the citizens of Salem so they can see the progress that's being done, and they can decide every 5 years whether to continue this program or vote it down.
That's right.
My own personal opinion on that is I would go with that, so long as a lot of work is done up front, and we don't just parse it out and just go to the voters and say more or less, we're gonna do the same thing we've always been doing, we're just gonna do more of it. I'd wanna see something really done with the funds to really make an improvement. Mr. Whitehill?
I won't support it.
Okay. Mr. Paparotis, you haven't spoken yet.
I agree with Councilman Cushman. I think that, we can sell a 5-year plan, and I think we can earn it for the remaining. And I think if it's supply and demand, if we're asking for less, we'll get more votes. And I think that we need to, agreeing with everyone, we need to do it now. And I think we can sell the 1/4% easier than the 0.5%. And sometimes you gotta start somewhere. But if we make it indefinite, the tax, there's a chance we won't get any, and we absolutely need it. Everybody agrees with that. I think if we ask for too much on the percentage, we may not get any, and then we're stuck in a corner. So I'm tend to agree with Councilman Cushman on that. I think he's right on it.
Mr. Drummond?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think for the sake of getting things started, while I tend to agree with Mr. Whitehill, if it's realistically never going to go away, so let's talk about it now. However, if that is not likely to get out of committee, let alone get out of council, at least to get it in the hands of the voters, then I would go along with, let's look at a 5-year timeframe. But I think whoever sits on council 5 years from now, or as we approach that 5-year timeframe, has to seriously take a look and say, we haven't finished the job. And based on discussions that we're having, that the amount of money that we could be spending is just barely cutting, keeping our head above water. To go back to the voters every 5 years to say, if we don't, it's going to get tiresome. And pretty soon somebody out there is going to say, enough of that. Let's go back to the old world. If we did put it permanent and it's allocated for the purpose of streets, and in 5-10 years we've got 100% of our streets being redone every year, then we can sort of think about, let's cutting this back or allocate it to something else that we truly need. But again, if it's, we need something in the hands of the voters to think about and to make a decision on. And if saying permanent was going to put that in jeopardy, then I'll end up supporting that in order to get that done. That's all I got to say about that.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I would just like to ask the committee if the feeling that they have is that this K-9 unit would be put on the back burner for those 5 years. You're saying to put this off until March, to put something on the ballot for the K-9 unit.
Mr. Cushman?
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, my comment about being in March was if we see after discussions and see some hard numbers that we can't afford it ourselves or don't have any other means of funding it, then we would have to maybe put it on the ballot. And I was only saying separate it March until November, just so we don't cloud the issue. But I believe that there's ways of funding these dogs without having to go to the voters. I believe Auditor Brothers brought up a good point. If we do go to 1 1/4 tax, why not keep reciprocity, use that extra 1/4% as income coming into the city? And I don't know what that revenue stream would be a year. I can't imagine it's much. But there's something there that quite possibly we could target to discuss for the dogs as well. I don't think at this time, subject to change, because we don't know the numbers, but I don't think at this time we have to go to the voters for a levy or a millage for the dogs.
And I think, sorry, Mr. Chairman, I think that is the kind of why I'm saying if we take just that half a step back and look at things and come up with a, much like we're talking about for the streets, like have a plan in place so that we say, this is why we're asking for a 1/4 for whatever time frame, because we have this plan in place. Same idea with the dogs, that, we need X dollars. Maybe we don't need new vehicles, they can be retrofitted. Maybe we can get some donations from service clubs and other organizations towards the initial costs, so to speak. Maybe there's got to be some discussion on really, do we need 2 new officers, et cetera. At the end of the day, I think that, if we have those numbers, we might truly decide or determine that, we'll make this work without asking the voters to pony up another tax or levy. But if that discussion takes place and we don't think we can, then I think, yes, we're talking it for the spring vote, putting a question back on that ballot. We're not by any means, I think you said putting on the back burner for 5 years. I'm not talking that at all. you know,
Mr.
anything.
Drummond is committed to actually move this forward, maybe even faster.
Oh, yeah, yeah. But the bottom line is that, you know, my personal feeling is we need exact numbers, and I think we need, as much as I appreciate the numbers the chief has given us, and I'm sure has the ability to get some of those numbers from other departments. I know he's quoted Boardman and so on, that having somebody come and speak to us, you know, that is a canine handler, has those costs ongoing and has, you know, the experience of beginning a canine unit would be beneficial to us in making our decisions on exactly where we go with this.
Mr. Whitehill?
I want to say that I concur on the reciprocity issue. I actually had a note to that effect. I was thinking more from the standpoint of the revenue for the streets. What I want to just quickly caution is that you are at that point, if that ends up coming to fruition to where it is funded in that method, you will have both of them expiring at the same time. You will be losing both revenue streams at the same time, and you'll be having both funding issues on the same ballot again. I still feel like it's a temporary solution to a very long-term permanent problem. That opinion will change, and you, like saying that funding, they both expire at the same time.
Well, I'd like to test something because, you know, it does seem like we have general agreement on that we need to look into the canine unit. We need to do it post haste, you know, and not put it on any back burner, but we need more information on it. Mr. Drummond's going to move that forward. I hear general agreement that we need to have an issue on the ballot regarding taxes for infrastructure. And I would define infrastructure. Mr. Cushman made an email earlier in the week or last week. Infrastructure being specifically streets, sidewalks, curbs, and lighting. I would add, you know, storm sewers and storm sewer equipment. So with that being infrastructure, I'll make a motion to see if anybody will second it. I'll make a motion for a permanent property tax to raise, for enough millage to raise $1.2 million per year. Is there a second for that?
Property tax.
Yes. Okay, that dies for no second. I'll make a motion for a 5-year property tax for $1.2 million for infrastructure improvements. Okay, that dies for lack of a second. I'll make a motion for a permanent 0.25% income tax for infrastructure improvements.
I would second that.
Okay, there's a second for that. I'll call a roll then. Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
No.
Mr. Paparotis?
No.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
And my vote for that, it's my own personal conscience vote. I'm going to say yes on that, which means that that will move to council written that way. When it gets to council, I would suggest, because we have 2 council members absent, that a motion be made, you know, to change that if somebody wants to change it, and see if that passes. So that's my suggestion. So is there any other?
Can, in that motion, or in that ordinance resolution, whatever would come to council, there would be language that money, that 0.25% is earmarked.
Infrastructure improvements.
So there's no
Yeah.
ambiguity, no question at all.
And we will ask the law director to tighten up that language around infrastructure improvements. Right now, it's for streets, sidewalks, curbs, lighting, and waste, not wastewater.
Stormwater related
Yeah, stormwater related.
upgrades.
Right. And I'm also, my vote is contingent upon we continue those talks on a rationale for how the money's going to get targeted.
Sure.
And we've begun those talks, and I'll work with Mr. Cushman on putting a committee together for that, so that we can have something to tell the voters what we're actually doing with it. Yes.
I'm wondering if we can have in language in this ordinance that I'm hoping to remove the ability from council a year from now, 2 years from now, to say, well, as council, we're going to vote to change that, to take that 0.25% away, or not take it, like to now allocate it to something other than streets. So I'm wondering if there's some way of involving our engineer, whoever our engineer is, that they would have to be in agreement that we don't have any more streets to fix, so that now you can get rid of your allocation to just streets. Take it out of our hands, or council's hands, that says, we're going to vote to take part of that 0.25% back to pay for something. I don't know what, but.
Yes, auditor.
Okay. You don't need to do that, because when you put this on the ballot will say for whatever infrastructure that the law director is going to tighten up. Nobody can change that unless you take it back to the voters to get it changed. So you don't need that language. That it doesn't make any difference what council person is here.
So if this 0.25% went to the voters as a permanent tax,
For infrastructure defined
that
as.
0.25% is permanent until such time as
It goes back
it
to
goes
the
back to a
voters to
vote
change
to say
it.
we want to take
Right.
it out of that. Okay.
Right. Yeah, you can't change it, and council can't change it. Only the voters can change it.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, if there's nothing else, I don't think this is, well, next week, I could work with I'll talk to the law director. I'm going out of town tomorrow. So I'll try to talk to the law director tomorrow and see if we can get something moving on language on this. I imagine that the ordinance will have to have what the ballot language would be.
He's come up with the draft ordinance and resolution already.
Okay, great.
The only change would
Do you
have to
have
be.
it? Could you forward it to me?
Yeah, I have it here.
Okay.
I can forward it to you as well.
Great.
The only change would be, right at this point, would be 5 years to permanent.
Right.
It should be a couple clicks and backspaces and retyping, you should be good to go.
Okay. Is there anything else for the good of the order? If not, is there a motion to adjourn? Motion to adjourn, second by Mr. Drummond. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thank you.